Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pauline letters, and today we're going to be talking about 2 Thessalonians. And you can see we're going to do it here from the parking lot at Tropicana Field in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a wonderful city, but it's not the easiest one to get to, at least if you're coming from Tampa or from south of the Tampa Bay area. You have to go over a big bridge to get there, and there can be a lot of traffic. In the same way, 2 Thessalonians, as we're going to see, carries a beautiful message, but it's not the most accessible. It's got some really difficult passages in it that we're going to have to address, even though it's a pretty short letter, only 3 chapters in length. Before we delve into our usual agenda of the epistolary elements, our synchronic survey, and then inferences from the text and lingering questions, we have to deal with a very important and complex preliminary matter. Did St. Paul write 2 Thessalonians during his lifetime, or is this rather one of those disputed letters, one of those letters that was written by a disciple or some other follower of St. Paul, perhaps a generation or so after his death? There was a movement for much of the 19th and 20th centuries to think of 2 Thessalonians as Deutero-Pauline, as a letter that was written after Paul's death by a later disciple. In recent years, however, the consensus seems to have moved a bit away from this. This is still a hotly disputed topic within scholarship, but increasingly, and you can see 4 quotations here by reputable scholars, are increasingly, at least as I read the tea leaves, it seems that scholars are coming more and more around to the view that St. Paul did, in fact, write 2 Thessalonians during his lifetime. We'll talk a little bit more about this issue later in the class, but for now, I'm going to proceed under the assumption that it is, in fact, the historical St. Paul who is writing or dictating this letter during his lifetime. So that brings us to our epistolary elements. You can see them right here. 2 Thessalonians follows a similar outline to 1 Thessalonians. Like 1 Thessalonians, its senders are Paul, Silvanus, remember that's Silas, and Timothy, and it's written to the Thessalonians. If 2 Thessalonians is authentic, assuming I'm right that St. Paul wrote this letter during his lifetime, it means that Paul is addressing some new problems that arose after he had sent 1 Thessalonians. In that case, it would be much like how 2 Corinthians builds on problems that Paul had addressed in 1 Corinthians. If it's pseudonymous, if I'm wrong about that assumption, then really it's anyone's guess that a later Pauline disciple at some point is building on Paul's tradition, but for what reason we simply cannot ascertain. In any case, the message the letter seems to carry is to praise his addressee's faith and love, and we should add a love that is carried through patient endurance. The letter does speak in darker terms about the judgment that awaits those who oppose the gospel. It's clear that whoever's receiving this letter is suffering under persecution. The second part of chapter 1 makes that clear. Paul seeks to confirm his Christian believers amid deception and trouble. So let's do a synchronic survey. Let's outline the text. I borrowed this outline from Smith, the source is cited in the bibliography. After an exordium in the opening chapter in which Paul above all praises the Thessalonians for their patient endurance amid persecution, Paul in chapters 2 and 3 deals with the main body, which is all about maintaining the traditions. We see that word paradosis, which is the Greek word for tradition. It shows up twice here in 2 Thessalonians. That twofold occurrence may seem unremarkable, but in fact, this expression for tradition occurs with a positive connotation only 3 times in the Pauline corpus, including the 2 times here in 2 Thessalonians. Incidentally, the other one is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. But the body of 2 Thessalonians is focused on Paul's hortatory appeals. That is, Paul is encouraging, he's giving instruction, he's telling the Thessalonians what to do and not do. He's telling them not to be taken astray by apocalyptic enthusiasm. Apocalyptic enthusiasm. That's this idea, oh, the Lord's second coming is happening right now. These false alarms about the second coming. Paul wants to blunt people who may have gotten a little too excited based on what he said in 1 Thessalonians. He's also encouraging the Thessalonian church to avoid irresponsible behavior. Apparently there are some freeloaders in the Thessalonian church, people who are refusing to work because they think, oh, the second coming's coming, so who cares? Paul's saying, knock that off. Work for the food that you eat. Let him who will not work not eat. And then there's a peroration at the end, a peroratio at the end. Let's make a few inferences from the text. I've already mentioned tradition, so we have these 2 expressions. This first one comes from chapter 3, verse 6. We instruct you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to shun any brother who conducts himself in a disorderly way and not according to the tradition they received from us. Also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15, Paul tells the Thessalonian Christians, "Therefore, brothers, stand firm and hold fast to the traditions that you were taught, either by an oral statement or by a letter of ours." I find this latter passage quite interesting because Paul is saying, hold fast to the traditions taught either by an oral statement or by a letter of ours. The letter of ours is easily explained to be 1 Thessalonians, but this oral statement, in my judgment, that only makes sense if Paul's missionary visit was within living memory. If this had happened either when Paul evangelized the Thessalonian church on the second missionary journey, which I would judge most probable, or when he visited them, which he likely did on his third missionary journey. We know he wrote 2 Corinthians from Macedonia, quite possibly Thessalonica or Philippi or one of the other cities there in northern Greece. Another major inference we can make from the text, and I alluded to it earlier, is that he's telling the Thessalonian Christians not to fall into what we might call apocalyptic mania. He says, "We ask you not to be shaken out of your mind suddenly, or to be alarmed either by a quote-unquote spirit, or by an oral statement, or by a letter allegedly from us to the effect that the day of the Lord is at hand." Apparently, like I was saying earlier, some people may have gotten a little too excited by Paul's discussion of the parousia in 1 Thessalonians. That, oh, the Lord's coming imminently, and so people are looking for it to come all the time. We should point out that if this is true, the Thessalonian Christians have had many successors in the United States over the past 150 years. But that's another conversation. What are some of our lingering questions? And I'd like to point to two. The first is a much debated passage even in antiquity. Later in that same section of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, "And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his time, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work." This section deals with a lawless one, quote unquote, who is being restrained. Presumably the Thessalonians knew what he was talking about, but his centuries of subsequent interpreters haven't a foggiest idea what he means. This passage uses a lot of the apocalyptic symbolism that we see in the book of Revelation, in the book of Daniel, our two whole cloth apocalyptic books in the biblical canon, as well as the apocalyptic passages of the Synoptic Gospels. Think Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. So we have a lot of language, but it's not entirely clear what all it means. This apocalyptic language has given rise to a lot of the speculation about whether this actually could have been written by Paul in the 50s. Some scholars suggest that this implies that Nero has already become the emperor and is persecuting Christians. I think those scholars have gone a little astray, but that is a legitimate theory. Our second lingering question concerns pseudonymity. That question we began with, did Paul write this? Scholars propose all sorts of reasons for arguing that he did not. Some will say that there's a similar format between 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and they'll argue that it makes more sense that someone took 1st Thessalonians and then updated it, say a generation later, or followed that format. It's too close to be true, almost. Some will say that Paul insists on his authority, on his writing with his own hand a little too strongly in 3:17. They would argue that that's to try and cling that Pauline mantle even closer by a later disciple who's writing after Paul died. Some other scholars point to the formal style. This is a much darker toned letter than the lighter and cheerier toned letter that we find in 1 Thessalonians. They'll also argue that there's a different eschatology, a more delayed eschatology, that the second coming is not imminent according to 2 Thessalonians, or that Paul uses different vocabulary in 2 Thessalonians. Again, I don't find these arguments persuasive. I think that they tend to exaggerate what's actually there in the text. Indeed, a lot of the differences that we see in 2 Thessalonians from 1 Thessalonians, they remind me a lot of the differences we see between 2 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians. In any case, these are the kinds of fun conversations we get to have in our Pauline class. Later on, we'll see some letters where the arguments for pseudonymity are a little stronger, and we'll address those in due time. Until then, read well and pray well.